Harlem, New York. 2:43 p.m. Wednesday, November 18, 1953. The first snow of winter clung to the cracked windows of Public School 127, turning the world outside into a gray blur of slush and shadows. Inside the administrative office, the radiator hissed like a dying animal, filling the stale air with the metallic taste of old pipes and institutional neglect. Principal Richard Caldwell sat behind his mahogany desk, the only piece of furniture in the building that wasn't falling apart, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the file of 10-year-old Jerome Washington. The boy stood in front of him, shoulders hunched, clutching a torn notebook, his shoes held together with electrical tape. Caldwell was a particular breed of predator. 51 years old, pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He'd held his position for 8 years through a combination of political connections and systematic brutality toward children whose parents couldn't fight back. The poor ones. The black ones. The ones society had already written off. He kept a leather strap in his desk drawer, worn smooth from use, and a manila folder filled with expulsion papers he'd signed with surgical precision. At 2:47 p.m., Caldwell delivered his verdict with the casual cruelty of a man who believed consequences were things that happened to other people. "You're expelled, boy." Effective immediately. The reason was fabricated missing homework, disruptive behavior, failure to pay the invented supply fees that Caldwell used to purge unwanted students. Jerome's mother worked 3 jobs, cleaning office buildings from midnight to dawn, scrubbing floors that would never be clean enough to wash away the stain of her son's humiliation. "Please, sir," Jerome whispered, his voice barely audible above the radiator's death rattle. "My mama said she can get the money by Friday." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, savoring the imbalance of power like expensive wine. "Your mama can't even keep you in decent clothes. Look at yourself, those shoes, that jacket." "We maintain standards here. This is an institution of learning, not a shelter for street trash." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Street trash. The phrase was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep and leave scars. Caldwell didn't whisper it. He projected it, ensuring maximum humiliation. Jerome's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He mentioned a name. "My uncle gonna come see you." Caldwell's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "And who is your uncle, boy? Another nobody who can't keep a job?" Jerome swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. Ellsworth Johnson. The name meant nothing to Caldwell. To him, it was just another black name on cheap paper, another empty threat from powerless people. He waved his hand with theatrical contempt. "I don't care if your uncle is Joe Louis himself. You are done here. Get out of my school before I call security." Jerome walked out at 2:51 p.m., clutching his expulsion papers, trying not to break in front of the other kids who watched from the hallway. He made it to the stairwell before his shoulders started shaking. What Caldwell didn't see was the woman waiting outside the iron school gates, Jerome's aunt, who'd taken the afternoon off from her job at the laundry to escort the boy home. She listened as Jerome choked out every word, every insult, every calculated cruelty. She didn't scream, she didn't curse. She said one sentence that would echo through the corridors of power like a death knell. "I'm calling Bumpy tonight." 8:17 p.m. That same evening, the back room of Small's Paradise on 135th Street. Smoke thick as velvet, the sound of cards shuffling, whispered conversations about money and territory. At the center table sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Dark suit pressed to perfection, diamond cufflinks catching the amber light, his face unreadable as granite. He listened to Jerome's story without interruption. Every word, every insult, every calculated humiliation. When the boy finished, the room went silent except for the distant sound of jazz bleeding through the walls. Bumpy didn't pound the table. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, straightened his tie with mechanical precision, and looked at his watch. "What's his name again?" "Principal Caldwell," Jerome answered. Bumpy nodded once. The sentence had been passed. "Tomorrow morning, you're going back to that school. Wear your best shirt." Jerome frowned. confused. "But he said I'm expelled." Bumpy's response was pure ice, delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. "He said a lot of things today. Tomorrow, he learns about consequences." 72 hours later, Richard Caldwell would be running through his own school hallway, sweat bleeding through his starched shirt, his kingdom of cruelty collapsing one brick at a time. The story of how Richard Caldwell lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to November 18th, 1953. Harlem in 1953 was a pressure cooker with no release valve. The war had ended 8 years prior, but the promises made to black soldiers who'd bled on foreign soil remained unfulfilled on domestic streets. Public School 127 stood on 118th Street like a monument to institutional neglect. 47 students crammed into classrooms built for 25, textbooks with pages missing. Windows that wouldn't close even when winter wind cut through the building like a razor. The heating system worked on a coin flip, and the paint peeled like old scabs. But the administrative offices were pristine. Mahogany desks, fresh paint, working radiators. The message was clear. Comfort was reserved for those who controlled, not those who learned. Richard Caldwell had occupied the principal's office since 1945, installed through a web of political favors his father had cultivated during 30 years as a municipal court clerk in Queens. The elder Caldwell had lived by actuarial tables and greased the right palms, ensuring his son's trajectory bypassed the usual requirements of competence or compassion. Richard had grown up in a middle-class enclave where black faces existed only as domestic help, where racial superiority was absorbed through dinner-table conversations and country club memberships. His obsession with maintaining standards was code for maintaining hierarchy. He didn't see students, he saw stains on his record that required systematic removal. The leather strap lived in his desk's bottom drawer, 18 inches of worn brown hide, polished smooth from frequent use against small palms. But physical pain was merely one tool in his arsenal. His preferred weapon was bureaucracy. He invented supply fees for books that never arrived, maintenance costs for heating that never worked, uniform deposits that disappeared into administrative coffers. When parents inevitably failed to pay these fabricated charges, Caldwell produced expulsion papers with theatrical efficiency, his signature flowing across the bottom with the flourish of a man who enjoyed his work. Every morning at 8:15 a.m., he positioned himself in the main hallway like a border guard, conducting inspections with military precision. He scrutinized shoes for scuffs, shirts for stains, fingernails for dirt. Children learned to walk past him with eyes down, shoulders hunched, trying to achieve invisibility. Jerome Washington never had a chance. His father had died at Porkchop Hill in Korea, taking shrapnel meant for 3 other soldiers, his body shipped home in a flag-draped coffin. His mother, Dorothy, worked the night shift at 2 office buildings in Midtown, scrubbing floors from midnight to 6 a.m., then rushing to a laundry service where she pressed shirts until 2 in the afternoon. The boy wore his father's old jacket, sleeves rolled up, the fabric holding the ghost of a man he barely remembered. His shoes were held together with electrical tape because new ones cost money that didn't exist. Caldwell had been watching Jerome for weeks, assembling fabricated charges with care, missing homework assignments that had actually been submitted, disruptive behavior that consisted of asking questions, failure to pay supply fees that had already been waived. On November 18th at 2:43 p.m., Caldwell summoned Jerome to his office, ensuring the door remained open so other students could witness the destruction. He made the boy stand for 17 minutes while he reviewed the file with theatrical slowness, then pronounced the expulsion loudly enough for the hallway to hear, using the phrase "street trash" with deliberate emphasis, watching Jerome's face crumble with satisfaction. Jerome's Aunt Beatrice was waiting outside the iron gates, having taken unpaid time off from the laundry. She listened to every word, every insult, every calculated cruelty, her jaw tightening with each sentence. At 8:17 p.m., she made the call from a payphone outside Small's Paradise. Bumpy listened without interruption, his face carved from stone, processing information with mechanical efficiency. Then he turned to his lieutenant and delivered his instruction with the finality of a death sentence. Find out everything about this Caldwell. Ellsworth Johnson operated under a code that others mistook for criminality when it was actually mathematics. The system had equations written in law books that protected certain people and crushed others. When those equations failed to balance, alternative calculations became necessary. He didn't see himself as a gangster, he was a correction mechanism, the force that restored equilibrium when institutional power tilted toward cruelty. In his world, law was theater. Respect was the only currency that held value, and when someone stole it from those who had nothing else, the debt came due with compound interest. Within 6 hours of Beatrice's call, Bumpy's intelligence network had compiled a dossier on Richard Caldwell that read like an autopsy of institutional corruption. The information arrived in fragments throughout the night. By 9:02 p.m., a numbers runner confirmed Caldwell's gambling addiction and mounting debts to a Hell's Kitchen syndicate. By 10:19 p.m., a bartender in Queens described a pale man with shaking hands who bet on horses he couldn't afford. By midnight, a fired school secretary delivered the most damning evidence, records showing Caldwell had expelled 43 students in 8 years, every single one from families living below the poverty line. Every expulsion documented with bureaucratic precision that made appeals impossible. Caldwell's methodology was brilliant in its systematic cruelty. He never used racial slurs in official documents. Instead, he deployed phrases like failure to meet institutional standards and chronic behavioral deficiencies. He assassinated children's futures with paperwork, wrapping his sadism in the protective coating of administrative policy. He scheduled parent meetings during working hours, ensuring poor families couldn't attend, then cited their absence as evidence of parental neglect. His protection came from 3 school board members who shared his poker table and his prejudices, creating a shield of plausible deniability that allowed him to operate without oversight. A lesser man would have responded with immediate violence, brass knuckles in an alley, broken bones as punctuation marks. But Bumpy understood that physical pain was temporary. Psychological destruction was permanent. He wanted Caldwell to experience the same powerlessness he inflicted on children, to feel the systematic dismantling of security, to understand that cruelty had architects, and those architects could be demolished brick by brick. The strategy formed in layers around a 72-hour ultimatum, Bumpy's signature move refined through years of enforcing respect. 3 days gave a man enough time to feel fear, make desperate mistakes, and realize escape was impossible. It was long enough to watch everything unravel but too short to mount an effective defense. Caldwell would have exactly 72 hours from the moment Bumpy delivered the message to reinstate Jerome Washington and resign his position. Compliance would limit the consequences to professional ruin. Refusal would trigger escalation until nothing remained. By 2:30 a.m., on November 19th, Bumpy had mapped Caldwell's entire routine with military precision. Morning arrival at 7:45 a.m., hallway inspections at 8:15 a.m., lunch at the diner on 119th Street at 12:30 p.m., departure at 4:15 p.m. He knew about the Tuesday night card games, the $3,000 debt to Sal Torino, the wife in Queens who had no idea her husband gambled away his salary. Each weakness became a pressure point in the psychological campaign that would follow. At 2:47 p.m. On November 19th, Bumpy sat in the back room of Small's Paradise, smoke curling around him like protective spirits, the closed file on Caldwell resting on the table. His lieutenants waited for instructions, recognizing the expression that meant judgment had been rendered. He straightened his tie, adjusted his diamond cufflinks, and checked his gold watch. The decision was final. The pieces were in motion. Tomorrow at 3:00 p.m., he announced with the finality of a closing argument, "I'm going to school." Time for a parent-teacher conference at 2:47 p.m. On November 19th, Ellsworth Johnson stepped out of Small's Paradise onto 135th Street, beginning the 17-block walk to Public School 127 with the measured pace of a man who understood that power moved slowly because it didn't need to rush. He walked alone, unhurried, his protection woven from 20 years of favors granted and respect enforced. The moment his polished shoes touched the pavement, the rhythm of Harlem shifted like a record needle dragged across vinyl. His charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, the fabric draping without a wrinkle, pressed to knife-edge precision. Italian leather shoes reflected the cracked pavement beneath them, polished to mirror shine despite the November slush. A diamond pinky ring caught the weak sunlight with each swing of his arm, and his gold watch ticked with indifferent precision against dark skin. He wore authority like other men wore cologne, invisible but unmistakable. The street recognized him before conscious thought could form. Conversations died mid-sentence as if someone had cut the audio cable to reality. A numbers runner folded his papers and stepped aside. Two women carrying grocery bags stopped walking, pressing themselves against a storefront window. A group of teenagers playing dice on a stoop went silent, their game forgotten, watching the procession with reverence usually reserved for funeral marches. This wasn't fear, it was recognition of natural law. When the King of Harlem walked with purpose, the kingdom rearranged itself accordingly. He crossed 125th Street at exactly 2:54 p.m. His pace never varying, each step covering the same measured distance. A taxi driver nearly ran a red light, then hit his brakes hard when he saw who was crossing. Behind Bumpy, a wake of silence spread through the neighborhood like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. By the time he turned onto 118th Street, the whispers had already reached the school gates. At 2:58 p.m., Public School 127 materialized ahead, its brick facade stained with decades of neglect. A teacher smoking on the front steps saw him approaching and dropped her cigarette, crushing it under her heel before retreating inside. The door closed behind her with the finality of a vault ceiling. Inside, the atmosphere curdled before anyone understood why. Mrs. Patterson, teaching fourth-grade arithmetic, felt the change first, a pressure in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. Her sentence died halfway through. Students turned toward the windows without instruction, sensing something fundamental had altered. In the hallway, a janitor mopping floors looked up, his instincts screaming warning signals he couldn't name. The building itself seemed to hold its breath. Bumpy entered through the main doors at exactly 3:00 p.m., removing his hat with practiced grace. He didn't stop at the reception desk. He didn't ask for permission. His footsteps echoed on linoleum floors with metronomic precision. Click, 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 each sound a countdown to reckoning. He moved past the trophy case, past the bulletin board covered in faded announcements, with the confidence of a man who owned every inch of ground he touched. Teachers emerged from classrooms drawn by instinct, standing in doorways, watching the procession with the fascination of witnesses to historical events. Students pressed their faces against windows, understanding something important was happening. The silence was absolute now, heavy and suffocating, as if the building was holding its breath. The hallway to Caldwell's office stretched 47 feet. Bumpy covered it in 32 seconds, his pace never changing, his expression revealing nothing. At 3:04 p.m., he reached the frosted glass door marked Principal R. Caldwell. Inside, Richard Caldwell sat at his mahogany desk reviewing fresh expulsion papers, his fountain pen poised above the signature line, completely unaware that judgment had arrived and was standing 3 feet away. The door handle turned at 3:04 p.m. Without a knock, brass grinding against brass with the deliberate friction of a man who had never needed permission for anything in his life. Richard Caldwell looked up from his expulsion papers, fountain pen frozen mid-stroke above a signature line, irritation already forming on his thin lips before his brain could process what his eyes were seeing. The expression died instantly when Ellsworth Johnson filled the doorway. Bumpy didn't step into the room, he displaced the air inside it. Oxygen seemed to evacuate, replaced by something heavier, more dangerous. He closed the door behind him with surgical precision, the latch clicking like a coffin lid settling into its final position. No introduction. No explanation. No acknowledgement of boundaries or protocol. He simply existed in the space, and the space rearranged itself around his presence. He moved past the filing cabinets with fluid grace, each step measured and deliberate, and lowered himself into the wooden chair positioned directly in front of Caldwell's desk. The same chair Jerome Washington had occupied 24 hours earlier, trembling and humiliated. The symbolic reversal was immediate and devastating. Caldwell, who had spent 8 years towering over frightened children from behind his mahogany fortress, suddenly understood what it felt like to be examined by power that didn't need to announce itself. At 3:05 p.m., the staring began. Bumpy's face revealed nothing. No anger, no disgust, no emotion worth cataloging. His eyes were flat black, the kind that had watched men die and felt nothing worth mentioning afterward. He simply looked at Caldwell the way a coroner examines a corpse, noting details with clinical detachment. Caldwell tried to hold the gaze for exactly 7 seconds before his eyes began watering. At the 15th second, sweat formed at his hairline despite the November cold bleeding through the windows. At the 30th second, his throat constricted. At the 45th second, his fingers twitched toward the fountain pen, then away, then back again. At 60 seconds, his collar felt like a noose. The silence became a physical weight pressing against his chest, crushing air from his lungs, making each shallow breath feel like failure. At 3:06 p.m. And 30 seconds after 90 seconds of psychological dissection, Bumpy spoke. "You have 72 hours to fix what you broke." His voice was surgical in its calmness, each word measured and weighed, delivered with the detached neutrality of a judge reading a sentence already decided by higher mathematics. Caldwell's survival instinct kicked in, dragging him back toward the familiar territory of institutional authority. "Now see here," he stammered, his voice pitching too high, cracking under pressure. "I don't know who you think you are, but I have direct connections to the Board of Education. I can have the police here in 5 minutes. You're trespassing on city property. There are laws, sir. There are procedures and protocols that govern." Bumpy's expression didn't change. He didn't move. He didn't blink. His silence was more terrifying than any threat because it suggested that laws and procedures and protocols were concepts that didn't apply to the mathematics he operated under. Caldwell's hand hovered over the phone receiver but couldn't complete the motion because some primal part of his brain understood that calling for help would only accelerate whatever was coming. "You have no authority here," Caldwell tried again, desperation bleeding into his voice. "This is an educational institution governed by municipal oversight and state regulation. I answer to elected officials, not to." He stopped, realizing he had no appropriate noun for the man sitting across from him. Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket with the slow deliberation of a man who had all the time in the world. Caldwell flinched, his body anticipating violence, but what emerged was worse than any weapon. A photograph. Black and white. Sharp focus. Professional quality. Caldwell himself, captured 4 nights earlier at 1:23 a.m. Outside Sal Torino's gambling den on 10th Avenue, his face clearly visible under the streetlight, money changing hands with a known associate of the Genovese family, his expression guilty and desperate and unmistakably his own. Bumpy placed it on the desk between them with the care of a chess player positioning a decisive piece, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the leather blotter. He didn't push it forward. He didn't need to. The image spoke with devastating clarity about debts and dependencies and the kind of secrets that didn't just ruin careers, they obliterated them. Caldwell stared at the photograph, his mind racing through calculations of damage, wondering how many copies existed, how far this image could travel, how quickly the protective structure he'd built from policy and political connections could collapse. His lips moved, but no sound emerged because his brain couldn't form words under the weight of complete exposure. At 3:11 p.m., Bumpy stood with fluid grace, adjusting his tie, smoothing the front of his suit jacket, preparing to leave with the same unhurried precision he'd used to arrive. Some children, he said, his voice carrying the finality of natural law, are protected by forces you cannot see. He walked to the door, his footsteps echoing with measured precision on the linoleum floor. At 3:12 p.m., he opened the door, paused for one final moment without looking back, and delivered his closing statement. The clock started when I sat down. The door closed with a soft click. Caldwell remained frozen in his chair, staring at the photograph that lay beside his unsigned expulsion papers, understanding with absolute certainty that his world had just ended and the 72-hour countdown to its complete destruction was already ticking in his ears like a time bomb he couldn't defuse. At 6 p.m., on November 19th, exactly 2 hours and 48 minutes after Bumpy Johnson walked out of his office, Richard Caldwell's secretary received a phone call that lasted 11 seconds. She hung up, walked to the filing cabinet with mechanical precision, and retrieved Jerome Washington's expulsion papers. Her hands trembled as she stamped them with red ink administrative error reversed. Jerome would return Monday morning as if nothing had happened, the bureaucratic machinery that had crushed him now operating in reverse with surgical efficiency. Caldwell watched from his doorway with the expression of a man watching his own execution being scheduled. November 20th arrived with winter rain turning Harlem streets into rivers of gray slush. At 9:17 a.m., Caldwell's phone rang. Sal Torino's voice came through without preamble, delivering financial devastation in 3 sentences. All outstanding debts were due immediately. No extensions. No negotiations. The $3,000 accumulated through Tuesday night card games needed to be delivered by 6 p.m., or interest would begin accruing at rates that made loan sharks look charitable. Sal didn't explain the sudden policy change because word had traveled through channels that certain people were no longer protected. By noon, Caldwell had called his 3 school board allies, the men who had shielded him through 8 years of systematic cruelty. The first didn't return his call. The second claimed a family emergency requiring immediate attention indefinitely. The third answered but spoke in careful language of a man distancing himself from plague, mentioning budget concerns and oversight committees, bureaucratic phrases that translated to "you're alone now." They could smell political death through phone lines, and survival instinct demanded separation. At 4:23 p.m., Caldwell walked to the faculty parking lot and found his Buick sitting on concrete blocks, all 4 tires removed with surgical precision and stacked in a perfect pyramid. A note was tucked under the windshield wiper, the paper crisp despite the rain, handwriting immaculate. Some things are hard to put back together. No signature. No threat. Just observation delivered with casual cruelty. November 21st brought psychological collapse into sharp focus. Teachers who had previously sought his approval now avoided hallways when they saw him approaching, suddenly remembering urgent tasks in opposite directions. Students who had once cowered now watched him with fascination of witnesses to public execution, sensing vulnerability the way predators smell blood. Parents who had accepted his authority without question started appearing in the main office demanding explanations for supply fees, their newfound boldness suggesting someone had informed them the rules had changed. His political connections evaporated like morning fog. The deputy superintendent who had fast-tracked his appointment was suddenly unreachable. The city councilman who had attended his poker games stopped returning messages. Even his wife sensed something catastrophic approaching, her questions about money becoming sharper, more accusatory. At 11:47 p.m. on November 21st, the final blow landed with bureaucratic precision. An anonymous letter arrived at the superintendent's office detailing Caldwell's gambling addiction, complete with dates, locations, and photographic evidence of his association with known criminal elements. The envelope contained no return address, but information inside was comprehensive enough to trigger immediate administrative review. At 3:04 p.m. on November 22nd, exactly 72 hours after Bumpy Johnson had delivered his ultimatum, Richard Caldwell sat alone staring at the resignation letter his trembling hands had typed that morning. The mahogany desk that had once symbolized power now felt like a coffin. His fountain pen lay beside the unsigned document, and he understood with absolute clarity that signing meant professional death, but refusing meant something far worse. The clock ticked past 3:05 p.m., each second reminding him the 72 hours had expired and consequences for non-compliance were now in motion. At exactly 3:12 p.m. on November 22nd, Richard Caldwell's fountain pen touched paper for the final time in his professional career, his signature flowing across the resignation letter with the trembling precision of a man signing his own execution warrant. The 72-hour cycle completed itself with mathematical perfection, the wall clock marking the exact moment his 8-year kingdom of systematic cruelty collapsed into administrative dust. He stared at the document for 17 seconds afterward. Understanding that power had never truly belonged to him, it had been borrowed from systems that could revoke it without appeal or explanation. His final day became a public execution conducted in bureaucratic slow motion. He packed his personal belongings, framed certificates that now felt like mockery, the leather strap he would never use again, photographs of a life that no longer existed, under the watchful eyes of students and teachers who lined the hallway like spectators at a Roman arena. They didn't jeer or celebrate. Their silence was more devastating because it communicated complete indifference to his suffering, the same indifference he had shown to frightened children for 8 years. The fear he had cultivated through systematic humiliation evaporated, leaving nothing behind except hollow recognition that he had never been respected, only temporarily obeyed. That same morning, Jerome Washington walked through the school gates wearing his father's old jacket, shoulders squared with newfound dignity. Teachers greeted him by name. Students who had witnessed his humiliation now made space for him in hallways with gestures of solidarity. His desk in Mrs. Patterson's classroom had been cleaned, textbooks replaced, his existence acknowledged as valuable. The symbolic reversal was complete. The boy expelled as trash now returned as living proof that some debts get paid regardless of institutional protection. At 4:47 p.m., Caldwell carried his cardboard box toward the exit, but not through main doors where professionals departed with handshakes and well wishes. Instead, he was directed to the back service entrance, the same path used for garbage removal and deliveries. He slipped once on ice in the alley, scrambling to keep his possessions from spilling into the gutter beside overflowing dumpsters. The symbolism wasn't accidental. He was being discarded through the same route he had mentally assigned to children he deemed unworthy. The next morning, the interim principal discovered a note placed precisely in the center of Caldwell's abandoned desk. Typed on school letterhead with surgical precision, "Trash takes itself out." His own words from Jerome's expulsion returned with compound interest, a reminder that cruelty has memory and consequences have architects who never forget. The ripple effect moved through Harlem's educational system like seismic waves. Within 3 months, expulsion rates dropped 40% across the district. Other principals quietly reversed questionable suspensions. Supply fees mysteriously disappeared from budget requirements. Hallway inspections became less frequent, less humiliating. The message had been received and decoded. Certain children were protected by forces operating outside official channels, and disrespecting them carried costs that bureaucratic shields couldn't deflect. Jerome's education continued without interruption. He graduated from Public School 127 in 1957, then Benjamin Franklin High School in 1961, earning his diploma through persistence that had survived systematic attempts at destruction. He became a teacher himself, returning to the same neighborhoods that raised him. Understanding that education was warfare and some students needed advocates willing to fight battles the system refused to acknowledge. In his desk drawer, beneath lesson plans and grading rubrics, Jerome kept a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1968 reporting Bumpy Johnson's death. The photograph showed a man in an immaculate suit, expression revealing nothing, diamond ring catching camera flash. Jerome never spoke about November 1953, but the clipping remained as private testimony that justice sometimes arrived from unexpected directions when institutional protections failed the vulnerable, proof that some guardians operated in shadows, protecting those the light refused to see.